This is Andrea Gregg, and you're listening to Death Talk Canada. Here at Death Talk, we're going to be discussing everything death. As a funeral director and embalmer, I'm surrounded by death every day. We will be discussing loss, grief, trauma, dying, palliative care, the MAID program, and the funeral industry. This is for anyone who's ever suffered loss, who lives with grief. My hope is to help you in some way by shining light on these difficult topics. Thank you for listening. Welcome to Death Talk Canada.
Thanks, Andrea. Good
Thank
to
you
be
so
here.
much. Great. Thank you so much for being here. I think that you have a really interesting story that could inspire a lot of people. And maybe we'll just start by getting you to introduce yourself and give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So my name is Jamie. I'm a funeral director here in Nova Scotia, dual licensed, so a director and an embalmer. I was a little bit of a late bloomer. I didn't become licensed until I was close to 40. So this is my third profession. And yeah, so that's kind of it. I'm originally from Ontario, a small little community 2 hours west of Ottawa. That's home for me. I spent 13 years in the city of Ottawa and moved to Nova Scotia about 15 years ago.
Wow. And what were
Yeah.
you doing before you came to Nova Scotia, work-wise?
Work-wise, so I was a student for a long time. When I first moved to Ottawa, that was back in 1998. I went to Carleton University and I pursued a commerce degree. So that was my first career. I was in banking. So through the summers as a student, I worked at the British Embassy for a summer. I worked at the Royal Canadian Mint, so actually making coins. I did that for a summer, leading into the millennium, and I worked at a credit union that was part-time. And then things kind of changed a little bit. I took a bit of a career change as a result of an illness. And right up until I moved to Nova Scotia, I was a student. Yeah.
And I guess I'll preface it by saying that you and I know each other because we used to sort of work together.
Yeah.
And you were the Catholic priest in the community where I worked, and so you and
Yeah.
I often conducted funerals together.
Yeah.
Do you mind explaining a little bit what brought you
Sure.
into the priesthood?
Absolutely. So it, as I mentioned, I was a student in pursuing a commerce degree at Carleton in Ottawa. And so at the end of my third year, so it was the summer of 2000, it was Canada Day. I remember it very specifically. I woke up in the morning and I had really, really bad cramps. And I thought it was something I ate maybe, but it kind of went on for days and the days became weeks. And finally, I ended up going to the doctor and referred to different specialists. So it turned out that I had ulcerative colitis, and the illness progressed very, very rapidly, and I did not respond to any treatment. But in my own stubbornness, I still wanted to finish university, so I had 1 year left. And so the last year of university, I was very, very sick, and I think I was down to about 102 pounds. So as you know, I'm not a very tall person. 5'4", but I was about 140 pounds maybe at my healthy weight. And so having lost about 40 pounds off of my frame, I was so sick. And at the time, we didn't know what was wrong. So the doctors didn't know, the specialists didn't know. This was before I was diagnosed with the colitis. I was just losing all this weight. Every time I was going to the bathroom, I was passing blood, passing mucus. I couldn't go out in public very much because it was not very pretty because I was just not well. And so what happened kind of during that time is I eventually saw a specialist who he had showed me some results of a colonoscopy that I had, and the 90% of my colon was infected with this disease. And as we looked through the images, it showed that the ulcers, some of them had become so dark that they were black. And so he said to me that this is pre-cancer. And he would even say that at the time, he said this even could be cancer. So he said that I had two options. I either have a very invasive surgery that would require my entire large intestine to be removed. So my entire colon, rectum, and probably appendix and spleen because they're all attached. So the surgery would be about 7 hours. And right after the surgery, I would need to wear an ileostomy for a few months. And with the hope that they could reconnect everything inside. So that was one option. Option number two is just basically hope that it goes into remission, but I was not given a good prognosis. He said probably I had about a 50% chance of survival without the operation and a 50% chance of survival if I had the operation. So it was at the age of 22, that's not something that you want to hear. So that was where things really started to change. So that summer, I made a decision that even though I would continue and graduate from university with my degree, that I would consider becoming a priest because when you're that sick, you kind of view your mortality a little bit more closely. It's not something you think you're going to look at 22 years old. I'm thinking maybe when I'm 80, I'll think about, the meaning and purpose of life and why am I here and that kind of thing. So for me, that was what happened. So I ended up joining the seminary while having to go through these operations. So that happened in my first year as a seminarian when I was in Ottawa. So I had these two major operations. Obviously, I recovered. And when I joined this community to become a priest, there were 17 in my class. And in my own pride, I think that was one of the reasons I just kept going is because I recovered from my surgery. I stayed in school. I continued to do well. I excelled in the programs, theology, philosophy. And before I knew it, I was the last one left out of all my classmates.
Really?
And yeah, so again, there was a pride there. So I kind of thought this is where I need to be right now. So I just kept at it. And um, I don't think I quite knew the gravity of what I was getting into at the time. Um, I
Did
guess
you,
we could.
sorry, Jamie, did you attribute your recovery to your faith at that time at all?
I did, and I think initially I probably said I will consider to be a priest if I can recover from this. And so I think there was even a little bit of guilt that went on top of that, that
Yes.
because I survived, I therefore need to finish this and I need to do this and I need to bring this to completion. So, and I did. I can say I did it. And that was the catalyst that moved me from Ontario to Nova Scotia.
Right.
So, my first assignment as a Catholic priest in 2009 was here in Nova Scotia. So that was what brought me. And so, anytime I look back and I look at, my departure, even my time with the church, do I regret it? Um, I know that if I had not done that, I would not be in Nova Scotia. So
You had a
to me,
path.
it was like,
Yep.
it was the path, yeah.
That was your path.
And a stepping stone into what I needed to do next, the way I see it. So.
And what was life like for you as a priest? I think some people who don't really know from the outside looking in, what is it really
Yeah.
like? How do you
Yeah.
live? How is your day-to-day schedule? What was it like for
Mhm.
you? And maybe some of the pros and some of the cons, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So, I mean, I did it for over 8 years. So I think we can say I gave it a good crack. Um, And it was intense. It was very difficult. Um, I think there were a couple of dark things that happened when I became a priest and when I moved here. So one of the things that was in the background is I had discovered that the priest who baptized me as an infant, um, he was he was charged for some crimes. And so I don't think I need to get into details there, but that definitely kind of shook my faith and just my belief in the institution, particularly because there were relatives and friends of mine that were directly impacted by that. And this had happened many years ago,
Yeah.
but the allegations didn't come out until I was ordained. Um, so there was that dark cloud, and then there was also something local that happened here that was very similar. So already I felt very ashamed to wear a collar in public. And so when I was in public, if you ever saw me at a store, I was often dressed like this,
Yeah.
incognito. So there was already a bit of a shame that I felt. And I don't know why, but that was always there. And I guess for me, I don't think I quite understood that this was more than a job. And I thought I wanted it to be a job, not a vocation or a
Yeah.
life. And
Right.
but it was a life. And um that wasn't clear at the time. So at the same time, you're asking what did I find enjoyable about it? Well, I connected well with the community. I think the community connected with me. I enjoyed the people. There were many, social things that I enjoyed. Sacramentally, I thought there was some very powerful things that happened in the church and things that I witnessed. And particularly when it came to death and funerals and having to anoint the sick when they went into the hospital. And there were many, many individuals that I was with at the moment of their death. So there was already, I think, the seeds being planted of what I do now because I got to see the before part and now it's the after.
You were always very comforting to families, and I always you and I had talked before, and we both felt like we were colleagues when we both
Hmm.
felt that way, that we were
Hmm.
like both in the church together or both at the funeral home together. And you and
Yeah.
I actually never really did work together in the funeral home, but
No.
just doing funerals with you as the priest, it felt that way because you were so in sync
Yeah.
with what I was doing at the time too, and
Hmm.
families I think
Hmm.
felt a real connection with you. And
Yeah.
so for me, the transition isn't that shocking, but it must have been a
Hmm.
very difficult time for you, to make that decision, to the leap of
Yeah.
faith, should we call it?
Abs yeah,
Oh my
absolutely.
goodness.
Absolutely. And just with regard to my departure, like that was very difficult, very painful. It was not a very there was nothing really positive in how everything happened when I left. Obviously the community had a very difficult time. And again, I felt like it was a job. So I was going from one job and going into another job, but that was not perceived by everyone. And,
I can't imagine.
I should have stayed, right. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah, because the last time that I was working in the same area as you, you were very much still Father Jamie. And that's what I
I still
called you,
was.
and so even
Yeah.
for me, for that transaction,
Yeah.
that transition was it's a shock when
Hmm.
people, you had such a leadership role. And then it was like, I remember thinking, like, it's not a huge jump for me to think that he'd be interested in the funeral profession. However, going from having that powerful sort of position and then
Mm.
starting over again, there must have been a little bit of a hard time with that too, kind of starting all over again from the bottom up and having to be like the apprentice now, and learning the
Yeah.
new funeral industry.
To be honest, that was the easy part
Interesting.
because because when you say about being up high, that to me brings anxiety, and that's one of the reasons I left. Because
Yeah, good point.
what that place is that you're referring to is a pedestal, and that pedestal is a very lonely place. And I didn't want to be on the pedestal anymore.
Wow.
And so I wanted to get off of the pedestal and be with everybody else, be like everybody else. And because there's two things on that pedestal that you realize quickly as a priest. One of them is isolation. So you're not allowed to have a family of your own. You're not allowed to have a partner. But yet you're supposed to minister to families. You're supposed to minister to couples and meet them where they're at. But when you're not living it yourself, it's very hard to relate.
It
So
would
that
be,
was
yes.
one thing. Yeah.
I never thought of that.
The
That's kind of eye-opening. Yeah.
yeah. And the other factor too, tying into my own departure is I really felt there was just in line of my own kind of way of thinking and teaching. Um, I didn't realize how exclusive it was. And so to be in a congregation that's beautiful, lovely, wonderful people, but it's only one group of people that you're with. It is one piece of a greater picture of what the world is.
Yeah.
And I think that was the misconception that started when I was a child. And as much as I love my upbringing, where I was raised, having a loving family, friends, um, it was very sheltered in the sense that because I lived out in the country, I went to a Catholic elementary school. So right up until I was 13, I only knew Catholic people. I didn't know anybody outside of that. I didn't know there was anybody else.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so then high school, I went to a public high school, which originally was a Catholic high school with a Protestant wing. But it wasn't until probably the maybe 70s or 80s that they made it a public school that so I got to see more um uh just more different religions and more people, more diversity, if you will.
Yes. And the other
And
thing I thought
but
about when you were
but
saying that, oh, sorry, Jamie, I was just going to say,
no,
I wonder if people too um, weren't sometimes their true selves to you because you were the priest and in as an individual, I need to watch what I'm saying. I need to be careful. So I wonder if you felt that.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think that at the heart of it, when you say true identity, there's two parts to it. So there's the person, and I don't mean to put on different levels, but let's say this is me as a priest, and this is who I'm talking with as a brother, a sister, a friend, whatever the relationship is. We need to be the same. And but are we living our true identity? And that for me is that I wasn't. So as somebody that knew from a very young age that I was not attracted to women from a
Yeah.
young age. I never chose to be that way. I thought I would be one day married with children, but it just wasn't there. The attraction wasn't there. And every woman I saw, regardless of how beautiful they were, to me, they were my sister.
Yeah.
So I could never quite, but I knew attracted to men. And so that was that other gray cloud that followed me my whole life. And I think about how obviously as a child in elementary school, you're not aware of that kind of thing yet, really. But in high school, I knew very well then.
Absolutely.
And but then when you look, okay, you know what? This is back in the 90s. I was in a high school with over 500 kids, and not a single one of them was out of the closet. Not one, not one.
I
because that
honestly,
was taboo.
you and I are close in age, and I honestly can't think of anybody that was
Yeah,
openly
yeah,
gay when I was a teenager either, to be
yeah.
honest.
And now when I look at on Facebook now, I've reconnected, of course, with some of my old
Yeah.
high school friends, and then I'm going, wait a minute, I didn't know that. And then you see them with their respective partners and living. So going back to this true identity that you were talking about, so maybe the congregation member feels they can't be true to themselves with clergy, but I know for me, I couldn't be a hypocrite either because I wasn't living in my true identity.
Wow.
So,
Yeah, that's huge.
yeah.
And what a brave thing that was for you to do. I mean, I can't even imagine what that must have been like to, you know, be open and honest finally. So
Yeah.
did you feel, I mean, I'm Catholic girl, I can say it. I mean, there's
Hmm.
certain things, unfortunately, that I don't agree with, that they don't,
Hmm.
you know, okay, you know. Did
Right.
you feel
Yeah.
pressure while you were in the church that, you know, like that maybe this isn't what I like? Were you trying to shove that part of you away, as I guess is what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, it must have.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great question. So, as I said, I did it for 8 years, and I kind of felt over time things began to become more difficult, spiritually, emotionally, mentally. And I think that was the part near the end that so I knew months before I left the church that I was leaving the church. I knew the signs were there. And there was a particular event that really made me turn the corner and made me realize this has to come to an end sooner rather than later. I can't put this off anymore. And it was December of 2016. I was at Mass. I was celebrating Mass, and I started to get chest pains, like really significant chest. And I was literally almost like I don't have it now, but I can just remembering it makes me almost feel that heaviness that I had at the time. And so I was talking differently because I was like, I couldn't catch my breath. And so here I was standing in front of this group of people, and nobody noticed that I was breathing differently, except for a couple that was sitting in the congregation that I'm proud to say I'm friends with to this day. And they came to my wedding, and anyway, so I love them for seeing that at the time, for
Yeah.
seeing the weakness in my humanity that, okay, there's something not okay. So after Mass, they said to me, "You're not okay." And I said, "No, I'm not." So I went to the hospital. They did a battery of tests, EKG, X-ray, blah, 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 blah. So of course, it was not a heart attack. It was panic. It was anxiety that had built up
Yeah.
to a point where like this mental anguish that I was feeling as a result of my isolation, as a result of my loneliness, as a result of the pressure of being a priest, because it's fairly intense and it's 24/7. I just did not want to live that anymore. And um, that's kind of where things started to change a bit. But it didn't happen overnight. Like it was a few months before things really came to a head. And I can talk about that if you wish.
Yeah, what was that process like? I just, yeah, I mean, it can't be easy getting
Mm.
out of the
Yeah,
priesthood, I imagine.
right.
So do you
Yeah.
mind explaining a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, so I can. So just in terms of timelines, so I left the church in May of 2017. And at that point, I had already knew that I wanted to leave. And what had happened is I initially had asked for a sabbatical from the the religion or the community I was with. So the sabbatical would have afforded me to go to therapy, to maybe kind of dig a little deeper. And so the undercurrent here is that I had met someone too, someone that I was felt an attraction to. So this beautiful man that at the time who he's now my husband. I'm happy to say that. But he was in a dark place too because his mother wasn't well, and his mother's partner at the time was actually dying. So I'm gonna try to wrap this up, but this is you actually come into this story here, and you may not remember this. So February of 2017, my partner, who's my partner now, my husband, um, but he tells me that his mother's partner had died. And so I'm the one that actually called the funeral home to say that he had died, and you were the one who answered the phone.
Was I?
You were the one that answered the phone.
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness. You'll have to
And
remind
it
me.
was so it was 6:30 in the morning that I called, and I just remember how bubbly you were on the phone. Um, so here, and I knew what being on call was like because in the church, I
Yes.
was on call too, right? And so I could relate to oh, great, I'm waking her up, right? But I just remember how you answered the phone, Andrea speaking, and you knew who I was because we had worked together. So I had called to tell
This
you
is ringing
that,
a bell
my
now.
friends, yeah. So my friend's mother's partner had died. And so there's kind of a weird connection there that,
Yeah.
all these years later. But that at the time, that was probably one of my darkest moments because I was on my way out in a sense of leaving the church. I was depressed, I was anxious, and all this other stuff. And so going back to me requesting a sabbatical, that was declined, basically saying that I should still be able to function in ministry somehow because of the shortage of clergy that there was. Um, the alternative was that I would relocate immediately to Ontario so that I could undergo like therapy and things like this to kind of help me along with what I needed, which I didn't see to be an option either because my therapist was out here in Nova Scotia, my doctor was in Nova Scotia, and my spiritual director was in Nova Scotia. I
Mhm.
wanted to stay here while doing my sabbatical for my own health,
Absolutely.
but it was perceived that I was being disobedient. And I was then kind of given the ultimatum that if I wanted to stay here in Nova Scotia, I would have to take a leave of absence, which effectively means that I get no pay, I get no medical benefits. I was cut off effectively. So that for me was a very real wake-up call that, after 8 years of giving everything, literally everything, sacrificing a family, sacrificing every holiday
Yeah.
away from my own family um, in Ontario, that this was how I was um, received, how I was treated. So I thought, you know what, I'm young enough that I can walk away from this and I can start over. And yeah,
Wow.
so
The
yeah.
courage that must have taken you. I mean, I'm so happy for you though, for finally being able to see your true self and your true identity and
Mhm.
be out and not hide it anymore.
Yeah.
I've always felt, Jamie, that when you're not meant to be somewhere, that you feel uncomfortable. You know, your anxiety, your physical, mental health is just affected. And I can
Mhm.
relate to that because I've been there before where I'm like, this isn't feeling comfortable for me anymore. It's not meant for me. And
Right.
everything that you talked about sounded just like that you just were getting all of these signals that this is just not what I'm meant to be doing anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
when you're hiding your true self, that's,
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah.
brave
And
man you are.
thank you. Doesn't feel like it sometimes, but thank you.
You are. So I have to ask the big question. What
Mhm.
made you decide the funeral industry was for you?
Yeah. So That's a good question. So we can actually go back to where I told you I called because my partner's mother's father had died. So uh, I had actually gone into the funeral home to help with the arrangement part. And it was a colleague of yours that I met. And and I kind of made a mention in passing, maybe, I need to think of doing something else because I was just worn out. And I know the funeral industry, there's always openings in a sense that um, they're always looking for professionals. So I put that in the back of my mind, and I thought I would need a little more time because in May of 2017, when I actually left the church, like I moved out of the rectory, I moved out of after I decided like I'm not coming back. Um, I thought I was going to take about a year off to figure out what I wanted to do. And then I realized that the program, the funeral service and allied health, was offered every 2 years. So this
Right.
was probably like May or June by that point, and I realized that registration was for September. So I kind of thought, do I wait 2 full years or do I just jump into it? And I know how I am, like I can't sit still for too long. So it was a fairly hasty move where I jumped into it right away. And because of the repertoire I'd already built between being a clergy and with the funeral homes that I had worked with, it was a fairly easy transition because I knew everybody. And
Absolutely, yes.
I had done literally probably close to 400 funerals as a presider at a fairly large church. And so I knew many of the directors, and there was a weird sense of satisfaction or reward when I'd done a funeral as a priest. So that was probably one of the things that I'm not going to say I enjoyed. I don't enjoy seeing people hurting or grieving, but it was rewarding. And that is what has carried over into this profession.
Absolutely. It's meaningful. You're
Yeah,
you're truly helping somebody when they're going through the worst time in their
yeah,
lives. Yeah, I can
yeah.
relate to that. Um,
Mm,
so was it what you thought it would be? So you have both licenses. You're a funeral director and an embalmer. Is
yeah.
there one aspect that you like over the other?
I honestly would say that I prefer doing embalming, but I don't anymore. Um, and it's just because of where I am right now that the need is for somebody to do arranging and to take care of the families on the front end. Um, that is kind of where I'm at right now, even though I would prefer to be a little bit more. I think because I've been in the public eye so much and dealing with people so for so long, that part does get very cumbersome and tiring
Yeah,
and
it
mentally
does.
draining.
It
Yeah.
does. I remember briefly, I was mainly just in the preparation room and just embalming, and I missed meeting the people. And that surprised me
Yeah.
because I had at that point
Right.
been rather tired of that and stressed and
Yeah. Yeah.
and then when I wasn't doing it much anymore, I really missed it. So I've
Right.
kind of gone back and forth with which aspect I prefer, but I guess it's a little bit of everything. But for you, I can
Hmm.
definitely see you being excellent with families. There's no question there.
Right.
Come very
And
naturally.
yeah, and I do think even my previous career, like it does help with it for sure. And
Mhm.
I know that for my own self, I could not do this if I did not have some kind of belief system behind me. And I never was a preachy person, even when I was a preacher. But I know for myself what my convictions are, and I know day to day that I need to have something in the back of my mind that reassures me that there's more to this than what we see here. And because I witnessed so much, like people who actually at the moment of death or prior to death, things that I witnessed and saw. that just gives me great hope that, it's okay.
Yeah.
And it's okay to be grieving, but don't give up hope because this is not it. This is not the end.
And I know, for me personally, I've talked about this before, but the families that have a faith system tend to grieve better. And maybe better is
Yeah,
not the right word, but they have a hope. They have that faith that there
they
is
do.
something beyond this.
Hmm.
And I definitely believe there is too, from my own experiences.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it doesn't mean that because you've made this shift, that you totally don't believe. It's just that you're,
yeah. And this is what I will say too, is that my departure from the church has increased my faith because I don't have these do's and don'ts. Well, I
yeah,
shouldn't say that. It doesn't mean to live an immoral life. It just means that some of the structures that are in place that are exclusive are not there anymore.
that's right.
Where I am now dealing with people of every religion, non-religion, age, race, culture, economic status. And you know yourself, Andrea, that when a person dies, it doesn't matter what they are, who they were, the end is the same for everybody. And that is what I will say that I actually love about what I do now is that there's no exclusion. Because I'm dealing with everybody. I'm dealing with Catholics, Protestants, Hindus,
Yeah,
faith, Sikh, Jew, everything, and then atheist or anyone that does not abide by any
yeah.
structure, which is fine because we're all the same in the end. And to me, that is what is a wake-up call and I just never knew that before. And it's something that I get to experience every day.
Yeah, I can relate to that as well. We're all going to the same place. We're all
Hmm.
ending up in the same scenario. And I remember it kind of brings up the first time I ever actually saw a deceased person. And I
Mm.
remember, we were working on the face and setting features, and I remember looking at this person's eyes, and it was there that I knew that whatever makes up a person, whether you want to call it a soul or a spirit, it was gone out of that. And I
Yeah,
know you know what I'm talking about.
absolutely.
And that was where my faith was sort of renewed again for me personally,
Yeah,
because I was like, they're not there anymore. This is
right.
literally just their vessel. And you
Exactly.
can't
Yeah.
understand that unless you've looked at a deceased person's eyes.
Hmm.
That
Absolutely.
they're gone.
Yeah.
And it has to go somewhere.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
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 Yeah,
And
I've always been inspired by you because I, have a little bit of a Catholic background, and
mhm.
it is very interesting to agree but have differences, and that's okay. I kind of have my own personal theory that there's no religion on earth that's 100% accurate.
Mm.
I think that there's
Mm.
still a mystery to it all, and we're all going to figure it out when we're there.
Right. Right.
That's my
Right. Yeah.
personal belief.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So what do you find now to be the most rewarding part of being a funeral director and embalmer?
So probably again going back to the families we serve, but also knowing that sometimes when you see them, they come in right off the street, right after the death has happened on the same day. They're completely distraught. They're not thinking very clearly. Um, but then getting to journey with them in that dark moment, and then whether it is a week later, a month later, 3 months later, you see them at a store, you see them out in public, life has gone on. It's still hard, and the grief is there because it never goes away, as you know. You make room for it. But what they will say to you is, "Oh my gosh, I can't thank you enough for what you did." And that's rewarding, and knowing that you've made it a little easier for them is rewarding. And that makes it worth it at the end of the day.
Were your eyes opened at all to how much responsibility is on a funeral director and embalmer? Because I know that was very alarming to me when I first started. It was, wow, there's a lot of
Yeah.
responsibility, and a
Yeah.
lot of like, not that it compares to being a priest, but it is a
Yeah.
vocation, I think.
It is.
Yeah, like we really give a lot of ourselves and our time.
And I think that is where the happy medium has to be, where um, I believe that, so I think that there's jobs and there's vocations and then there's lives, where I think that a funeral director probably floats around vocation somewhere, that it's more than a job, but hopefully it's not an entire life,
Yeah,
where you have something in between where yes, it is a job, and yes, you get a death call on Christmas morning, you have to go out and console that family and leave your Christmas dinner behind, leave your family behind, leave the unwrapped gift behind, so to speak, to deal with that. But knowing that when that part is done, you can still come back to your family and do that.
that's
You can
right.
still have a life outside of work where the vocation that I had before, I didn't feel like because it was a life, it was all consuming. It was 24/7. And I do hope that there's something in there where, but it is a fine line and it can be dangerous.
For sure. Yeah, I think
Um,
it's so important for a lot of professions, but ours in particular to find that um, work-life balance. It's difficult sometimes, and
yeah.
I think I can speak for most of us that we all do it because we love helping people, and
Mhm.
but we can't forget to take care of ourselves too, and our own families
Yeah.
and partners, and yeah.
Yeah. And it's okay to set boundaries. And what I've really learned is when I go on my days off, I put my auto reply on my email.
Yes, good.
And I don't I sometimes I do look at it, I admit, but it basically says I'm sorry, but I'm out of the office for 3 days. And but if the matter is urgent, please call this number. But that allows me to go back into my true identity, which part of which is a funeral director, part of which is, a minister, what's the word I'm looking for? Emeritus, I guess, from the past.
Yeah,
Um, but also I was a banker before too, and that's all part of who my identity is.
yeah.
But I've got a wonderful husband now, and we've got dogs and cats, and so we've built a life under that. And that for me has to be my number one priority. And
That
and
is
I do whatever I can outside of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Jamie, I'm so inspired by your story, and I'm so happy to call you a fellow funeral professional. And we've always stayed in touch, and I'm so happy that you're living your true self and your true life now, and with your partner and husband, I should say.
One thing that has only come to me recently, that at the end of a difficult day, sometimes because of what we do is not something that we can easily take home, because we don't talk about this necessarily with our partners, with our families, the gravity of grief that we deal with sometimes. We can relay that, we can share it, but what I've found really helpful is sharing it with another funeral director or another colleague. And even doing something like this, I think is very helpful, very therapeutic to talk to another person of like mind. But also, too, a couple of weeks ago, I went out with two funeral director colleagues in the evening. So for a couple of drinks, we had supper together. And that I didn't realize how much I needed that and how much I craved it. And we were able to kind of, laugh and make jokes and I came out of that evening going, I need this
You felt refreshed
for
and
my own
understood.
for my own sanity, and I felt understood.
Absolutely.
And so I just wanted to add that too.
It's true. And I do the same thing when I get together with friends that were colleagues of mine. Oh my Lord. And it's terrible because if you're with a group of people that aren't necessarily all funeral directors, the funeral directors gravitate towards each other and talk
Mhm.
shop the whole time.
Yeah. Well, it's true. And it's because it's what we do is so very unique and so necessary at the same time, but not a whole lot of people want to talk about it or
No.
want to the whole notion of death, it's inevitable, right? But we hide it.
Yeah.
We hide it in behind walls. We hide it behind whatever. We don't want
Yeah.
to talk about it, but it's
And
just
that's
good to have people to talk about it with.
and that's why we're doing what we're doing here.
That's right.
And I appreciate it, Jamie, again so much.
No problem. My pleasure. Thanks for the time.
Thank you.